If you pull out your phone right now and open up a map app, the very first thing it wants you to do is drop a pin.
Right. Yeah. Needs a starting point.
Exactly. It wants a starting point and it wants a destination. It essentially wants you to exist in a neat stationary box.
Hmm. And if you just keep driving without a set destination, the system gets totally confused.
Yeah, it keeps trying to reroute you back to a fixed location. And I feel like modern society is a lot like that map app.
That is a really great way to put it, actually.
Thanks. I mean, we just have this built-in expectation that everyone, everywhere, should have a permanent address, right? Like a fixed plot of land, a stationary existence.
It really is a deeply ingrained assumption. We tend to equate settling down with civilization, with progress and economic stability.
Oh, absolutely.
And the very concept of constant movement makes the modern administrative state incredibly uncomfortable. I mean, a state needs to know where you are to count you, to tax you, and to govern you.
Which makes sense from their perspective. But that rigid expectation is exactly what we are going to challenge today. So, welcome to this deep dive.
Yes, welcome.
Our mission today is driven by a fantastic request from you, the listener. We have our hands on a really fascinating piece of source material.
It's a great chapter.
It is. It's simply titled Pastoralists in the Modern World. And the format rule for today is pretty strict.
Right, we're doing something a bit different.
Yeah. We are going to read through this entire document step by step. I'm going to read a section of the original text exactly as written, and then we will immediately break it down into simple, easy-to-understand language.
No skipping around, no high-level summarizing. We are unpacking the whole thing.
Exactly. We're looking at communities that have survived, adapted, and really thrived for centuries by fundamentally refusing to stand still.
And to set the historical stage for you, we are talking about nomadic pastoralists. These are communities of people whose entire livelihood revolves around moving with their herds of animals.
Like sheep, goats, cattle, camels, that sort of thing.
Right. They move to survive. Now, if you think back to any history or economics class you might have taken, you probably spent weeks, maybe months, talking about farmers.
Oh, definitely. You learn about the agricultural revolution, land enclosures, factories, industry.
Yeah, it's all about the cotton gin, the assembly line, crop rotation. The narrative of human progress is almost always framed around putting down roots or, building a factory.
But this text calls out a massive historical blind spot, doesn't it?
It does. It explicitly states that pastoralists rarely enter the pages of history textbooks. They are often treated as if their lives just don't matter.
Like they're ghosts from a primitive past with no relevance to modern society.
Exactly. But as we're going to see today, that assumption is not just slightly incorrect. It is scientifically and economically backward.
So, have you ever felt like you are just forced to fit into a mold that doesn't work for your environment? Well, imagine an entire culture that looks at the stationary world and says, no thanks. The smartest thing we can do is keep moving.
It's a radical thought today.
It really is. Okay, let's jump right in. Let's unpack the first major environment the text explores, which is the mountains.
Perfect starting point.
All right, I'm going to read the exact text introducing our first group. Quote, in this chapter, you will read about nomadic pastoralists. Nomads are people who do not live in one place but move from one area to another to earn their living.
A very clear baseline definition.
Yeah, and it goes on. Quote, even today, the Gujar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir are great herders of goat and sheep. Many of them migrated to this region in the 19th century in search of pastures for their animals.
So we are in northern India here.
Right. Quote, gradually over the decades, they established themselves in the area and moved annually between their summer and winter grazing grounds.
Okay, let's pause there. This is where we really need to understand the geography.
Yeah, Jammu and Kashmir is super extreme, right?
It is defined by extreme verticality. You have towering, freezing Himalayan peaks, and then you have lower, warmer foothills.
Okay, let me read how they navigate that. Quote, in winter, when the high mountains were covered with snow, they lived with their herds in the low hills of the Siwalik Range.
Right.
Quote, the dry scrub forests here provided pastures for their herds. By the end of April, they began their northern march for their summer grazing grounds.
Let's break down the plain English translation of that.
Sure. So basically, nomads don't have a permanent home, and the Gujar Bakarwals move like absolute clockwork.
Because you obviously can't feed a massive flock of sheep on top of a snowbank.
No, you definitely can't. So in the winter, they stay in the low hills, the Siwaliks. It's dry, it's just scrub forest, but it's warm enough to keep the herds alive.
It's a pure survival baseline. But then the text notes that by the end of April, the entire community begins a northern march.
Let me grab the rest of that quote. Quote, several households came together for this journey, forming what is known as a kafila.
Ah, kafil.
Yeah. Quote, they crossed the Pir Panjal passes and entered the valley of Kashmir. With the onset of summer, the snow melted and the mountainsides were lush green. The variety of grasses that sprouted provided rich, nutritious forage for the animal herds.
The environmental trigger for that march is so crucial. April means the seasons are shifting.
Right, down in the low hills, it's getting too hot, and that dry scrub is getting exhausted.
Exactly. But up in the high mountains, the snow is finally melting. And what happens when snow melts on a mountain?
It reveals all that fresh, green, untouched grass that's been insulated underneath all winter.
Which the text literally calls rich, nutritious forage. What's fascinating here is the sheer logistical coordination.
The kafila, right?
Yes, the kafil. This isn't just, one guy walking his dog. Several households come together for this journey.
They are moving massive herds of animals, entire families, tents, supplies, all of these treacherous mountain passes.
And they do it because they know exactly when the resources in the valley are at their absolute peak.
It makes me think of snowbirds. You know, people who live in New York during the summer, but as soon as the first blizzard hits, they pack up and drive to Florida.
It's the exact same logic. You move to where the weather is comfortable and the resources are available.
But the difference is, instead of just retiring in an RV, this is an entire microeconomy moving together. Let me read how the season ends.
Go ahead.
Quote, by end September, the Bakarwals were on the move again, this time on their downward journey, back to their winter base. When the high mountains were covered with snow, the herds were grazed in the low hills.
It highlights a massive misconception. This isn't random wandering.
They're just waking up and saying, hey, let's try walking north today.
Not at all. It is highly calculated geographic mastery. They operate with the precision of a Swiss watch.
Totally dictated by the frost line and the blooming of specific grasses.
That is brilliant. So who is the next group the text mentions?
It shifts slightly eastward. Let me read. Quote, in a different area of the mountains, the Gadi shepherds of Himachal Pradesh had a similar cycle of seasonal movement. They too spent their winter in the low hills of Siwalik Range, grazing their flocks in scrub forests.
Okay, so very similar so far.
Yeah, but here's a twist. Quote, by April, they moved north and spent the summer in Lahul and Spiti. When the snow melted and the high passes were clear, many of them moved on to higher mountain meadows.
Still tracking the snowmelt.
Right. But listen to this next part. Quote, by September, they began their return movement. On the way, they stopped once again in the villages of Lahul and Spiti to reap their summer harvest and sow their winter crop.
Wait, let's pause there. That detail is huge.
I was honestly a little confused at first. It says they stopped to reap and sow crops.
Yes, it fundamentally breaks the stereotype of the pure nomad.
How do you balance farming and moving? It's like pausing a massive cross-country road trip to plant a garden, leaving it for months and picking the vegetables on your drive back.
That is exactly what they do. It requires an incredible understanding of crop cycles.
So they plant on the way up.
Exactly. They plant a specific crop in the spring as they pass through. They leave it to grow unattended while they spend the summer up high with the sheep.
Oh.
Then, on their downward journey in September, that crop is perfectly ripe. They harvest it and immediately sow a hardy winter crop that will grow while they are down in the foothills.
They are completely stacking their income streams.
It is incredibly smart.
Okay, the author includes a fantastic primary source here called Source A.
Oh, the Barnes quote.
Yes, from the 1850s, written by a British colonial official named G.C. Barnes. He's describing the Gujars of Kangra. Let me read it. Quote, the Gujars of Kangra are a similar tribe to the Gaddis.
Similar, but with a key difference coming up.
Quote, but their wealth consists of buffaloes instead of sheep and goats. These people live in the skirts of the forests and maintain their existence exclusively by the sale of the milk, ghee, and other produce of their herds.
So they are dairy specialists.
Quote, the men graze the cattle and frequently lie out for weeks in the woods tending their herds. The women repair to the markets every morning with baskets on their heads, with little earthen pots filled with milk, buttermilk, and ghee.
Notice the division of labor there.
Yeah, and it says, quote, each of these pots containing the proportion required for a day's meal, end quote.
Barnes paints such a vivid picture. The men live in the woods with the cattle, which is an intense, rugged life.
Out in the elements, protecting massive animals,
Right, while the women are the absolute economic engine of the community.
walking to the market every morning.
And did you catch the packaging detail? Each pot contains the exact proportion required for a day's meal.
Yeah, it's brilliant product packaging. They aren't selling in bulk to a wholesaler. They portioned out their product for the daily consumer market.
The men handle resource extraction, and the women handle manufacturing, logistics, and retail sales.
But I have to read the rest of this quote, because Barnes explains why they go up the mountain. Quote, during the hot weather, the Gujars usually drive their herds to the upper range, where the buffaloes rejoice in the rich grass which the rains bring forth.
Okay, so rich grass, naturally.
Quote, and at the same time, attain immunity from venomous flies that torment their existence in the plains. End quote.
That is such a visceral detail. Venomous flies.
Anyone who has ever been swarmed by horseflies in the summer totally understands this.
Exactly. We often think of migration as being purely about food, but it's also about disease and physical torment.
Yeah. If you leave a herd of water buffaloes in the sweltering heat of the plains, they will be decimated by biting insects and infections.
So walking them up a freezing mountain is a calculated health intervention.
Right. Okay, let's keep moving. The text shifts further east to Garhwal and Kumaon. Let me read this section.
Let's hear it.
Quote, further east in Garhwal and Kumaon, the Gujar cattle herders came down to the dry forests of the Babar in the winter and went up to the high meadows, the Bigyals, in summer.
Okay, some new terminology there.
Yeah, Bahabar and Bugyals. It says, quote, many of them were originally from Jammu and came to the UP hills in the 19th century in search of good pastures.
Let's define those terms clearly for the listener.
Definitely. The Habar is the dry forest area at the bottom of the mountains. That's their winter retreat.
And the Bugyals are the massive grassy meadows high up, usually above 12,000 feet.
Completely covered in snow in winter, but exploding with life in summer.
Exactly.
There's also a caption detail here about how they live up there. It mentions mandapes.
Ah, yes, the mandats.
These are little bamboo huts, right?
Right.
Workplaces made of ringle, which is a hill bamboo. They build them to live in and to make ghee.
Right. They set up an entire dairy production facility at 12,000 feet.
The text mentions other groups do this too. Let me read. Quote, this pattern of cyclical movement between summer and winter pastures was typical of many pastoral communities of the Himalayas, including the Bhotiyas, Sherpas, and Kinoris.
It's a universal mountain strategy.
But here is the most crucial insight from this whole first section. Let me read the exact sentence. Quote, all of them had to adjust to seasonal changes and make effective use of available pastures in different places. Quote, when the pasture was exhausted or unusable in one place, they moved their herds and flocked to new areas. This continuous movement also allowed the pastures to recover. It prevented their overuse. End quote.
I am so glad you pulled that exact quote. If you take away one thing from this section, it should be that.
Yeah, the allowed the pastures to recover part.
Modern society often looks at nomads and assumes they live that way because they haven't figured out how to build a brick house.
Right, like they're just behind the times.
But what the text is telling us is that this is an early, highly sophisticated, organic form of environmental conservation.
Think about it mechanistically. If you keep 1,000 sheep in one fenced-in field all year, they eat the grass down to the dirt.
Then they pull up the roots.
And their hooves compact the soil so nothing can grow. The field turns into a dead desert.
But if you move the sheep away just as the grass gets low and you don't come back for 6 months, the mountain heals itself.
The grass grows back. The ecosystem resets. By never staying in one place, they are actively preventing ecological collapse.
It is a perfectly balanced, sustainable system. And as we move into part 2, we are going to see how this exact same logic applies to totally different climates.
Okay, part 2. On the plateaus, plains, and deserts, we are leaving the snowy mountains.
Heading south.
Right. Let me read the intro to this group. Quote, not all pastoralists operated in the mountains. They were also to be found in the plateaus, plains, and deserts of India. Dangars were an important pastoral community of Maharashtra.
A massive community, actually.
Yeah, the text says, quote, in the early 20th century, their population of this region was estimated to be 467,000. Most of them were shepherds, some were blanket weavers, and still others were buffalo herders.
To understand the Dangars, we have to look at the contrast between two specific geographic zones in Maharashtra.
The Central Plateau and the coast. Right. Let me read how they used the plateau. Quote, the Dangar shepherds stayed in the central plateau of Maharashtra during the monsoon. This was a semi-arid region with low rainfall and poor soil.
So, a harsh, dry place.
Quote, it was covered with thorny scrub. Nothing but dry crops like bajra could be sown here. In the monsoon, this tract became a vast grazing ground for the Dangar flocks.
So the Central Plateau is where they ride out the rainy season.
Yeah, because even a little rain makes enough grass for the sheep. But then things change. Quote, by October, the Dangars harvested their bajra and started on their march west. After a march of about a month, they reached the Konkan.
No, contrast the dry plateau with the Konkan coast.
It's totally different. The text says, quote, this was a flourishing agricultural tract with high rainfall and rich soil. Here the shepherds were welcomed by Konkani peasants.
The word welcomed is key here. Why are they welcomed?
The text explains the timing perfectly. Quote, after the Kharif harvest was cut at this time, the fields had to be fertilized and made ready for the Rabi harvest. Dangar flocks manured the fields and fed on the stubble.
It's an absolute masterclass in economic symbiosis.
Let's translate those agricultural terms. The farmers just finished cutting their Kharif, or autumn, crops.
Right, so the fields are full of tough leftover stalks, stubble.
And the farmers need to clear that stubble and fertilize the dirt for the Rabi or spring crops.
Enter the Dangars with thousands of hungry sheep.
It's a perfect business partnership. The farmers need fertilizer and weed clearing. The shepherds need food for their animals.
And no money changes hands. It's an ecological transaction.
The text even adds, quote, the Konkani peasants also gave supplies of rice, which the shepherds took back to the plateau where grain was scarce.
They trade services seamlessly. But then the ecosystem flips the script again.
Yeah, quote, with the onset of the monsoon, the Dangars left the Konkan and the coastal areas with their flocks and returned to their settlements on the dry plateau. The sheep could not tolerate the wet monsoon conditions.
That environmental trigger is fascinating. Unlike the mountain nomads who flee snow, the Dangars are fleeing the rain.
Because sheep just cannot handle wet, marshy ground. They get foot rot.
Exactly, forcing them back to the dry plateau.
Okay, moving south into Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. Let me read about the groups there. Quote, here again, the dry central plateau was covered with stone and grass, inhabited by cattle, goat, and sheep herders.
Let's get their names.
Quote, the Golas herded cattle. The Kurumas and Kurubas reared sheep and goats and sold woven blankets. They lived near the woods, cultivated small patches of land, engaged in a variety of petty trades, and took care of their herds.
A very diversified lifestyle.
Quote, unlike the mountain pastoralists, it was not the cold and the snow that defined the seasonal rhythms of their movement. Rather, it was the alternation of the monsoon and dry season.
The ecosystem completely dictates their survival.
And here's that animal distinction you mentioned earlier.
Whoa.
Quote, in the dry season, they moved to the coastal tracts and left when the rains came. Only buffaloes liked the swampy, wet conditions of the coastal areas during the monsoon months. Other herds had to be shifted to the dry plateau at this time.
You really have to know your livestock.
Definitely. Now, there's another great primary source here, Source B, from Francis Buchanan in 1807.
Oh, this one is great for breaking stereotypes.
Yeah, let me read it. Quote, the families of the Gullas are very numerous. 7 to 8 young men in each family is common. 2 or 3 of these attend the flocks in the woods, while the remainder cultivate their fields and supply the towns with firewood and with straw for thatch.
What stands out to you there?
Well, I want to push back on the idea that these communities just do one thing.
Right, they aren't just aimlessly wandering.
Buchanan proves they are highly diversified. A single family has a dairy operation, a small farm, a firewood business, and a thatch roofing business.
If the sheep get sick, they still have 3 other income streams. It's extreme economic adaptability.
There's one more group mentioned here, the Banjaras. The text says, quote, Banjaras were yet another well-known group of graziers. They were to be found in the villages of Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra.
They cover a huge area.
Quote, in search of good pasture land for their cattle, they moved over long distances, selling plow cattle and other goods to villagers in exchange for grain and fodder.
So they are basically the long-distance freight haulers and traders of the era.
Which brings us to our final landscape,
Yeah.
the desert. Let me read about the Raikas of Rajasthan.
The ultimate test of adaptability.
Quote, in the deserts of Rajasthan live the Raikas. The rainfall in the region was meager and uncertain. On cultivated land, harvests fluctuated every year. Over vast stretches, no crop could be grown.
So water is the single defining variable here.
Quote, so the Rikas combined cultivation with pastoralism. During the monsoons, the Rikas of Burma, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, and Bikaner stayed in their home villages, where pasture was available.
Because the monsoon brings just enough rain to survive?
Right, but it doesn't last. Quote, by October, when these grazing grounds were dry and exhausted, they moved out in search of other pasture and water and returned again during the next monsoon.
And they specialize too.
Yeah, quote, one group of Rikas, known as the Maru Desert, Rikas herded camels, and another group reared sheep and goats.
Camels being the perfect biological adaptation to a landscape without water.
So, synthesizing this whole section, whether in the mountains, plateaus, or deserts, pastoralists survive by calculating an insane number of variables.
Timing, water, pasture, and relationships with settled farmers.
It is a highly complex intellectual way of life.
It really is. But sadly, this brings us to a major pivot in the text.
Yeah, the collision with the modern world. Part 3 is titled Colonial Rule and Pastoral Life. Let me read the opening question.
Okay.
Quote, under colonial rule, the life of pastoralists changed completely. Their grazing grounds shrank, their movements were regulated, and the revenue they had to pay increased. Their agricultural stock declined, and their trades and crafts were adversely affected.
A very direct question. And the text gives us 4 major changes.
Let's start with change 1, cultivation. Quote, first, the colonial state wanted to transform all grazing lands into cultivated farms. Land revenue was one of the main sources of its finance. By expanding cultivation, it could increase its revenue collection.
We have to look at the psychology of the British colonial government here. They are an empire, and empires need to extract wealth.
Right. Quote, it could at the same time produce more jute, cotton, wheat, and other agricultural produce that were required in England. To colonial officials, all uncultivated land appeared to be unproductive. It produced neither revenue nor agricultural produce.
That phrase is so telling. Unproductive.
It goes on, quote, it was seen as wasteland that needed to be brought under cultivation.
Wasteland.
To the nomad, that land is everything. It's the grocery store, the bank, the pharmacy.
But to a colonial accountant in London, empty grass doesn't make money, so it's a zero on a ledger.
So what do? Quote, from the mid-19th century, wasteland rules were enacted in various parts of the country. By these rules, uncultivated lands were taken over and given to select individuals.
They handed over to people willing to plow it.
Quote, these individuals were granted various concessions and encouraged to settle these lands. Some of them were made headmen of villages in the newly cleared areas. In most areas, the lands taken over were actually grazing tracts used regularly by pastoralists. So expansion of cultivation inevitably meant the decline of pastures and a problem for pastoralists.
It's like, imagine a landlord turning a beloved community park into a concrete parking lot just because the park doesn't generate rent.
Exactly. To the community, it's vital. To the landlord, it's wasted space.
It's a fundamental clash of worldviews.
And that was just the first blow. Here's change 2. Forest Acts. Quote, second, by the mid-19th century, various forest acts were also being enacted in the different provinces. Through these acts, some forests which produced commercially valuable timber like deodar or sal were declared reserved.
No, why target the forests?
Timber. They needed wood for ships and railways. Quote, no pastoralist was allowed access to these forests.
Completely locked out.
Quote, other forests were classified as protected. In these, some customary grazing rights of pastoralists were granted, but their movements were severely restricted.
And the colonial logic for this was biological, right?
Yeah, let me read that part. Quote, the colonial officials believed that grazing destroyed the saplings and young shoots of trees that germinated on the forest floor. The herds trampled over the saplings and munched away the shoots. This prevented new trees from growing.
The government thought animals eating baby trees ruined the forest for timber.
There is a quote here from H.S. Gibson, a deputy conservator of forests. He says, quote, a forest which is used for grazing cannot be used for any other purpose and is unable to yield timber and fuel, which are the main legitimate forest produce. End quote.
Legitimate produce. Again, dismissing the pastoralists' livelihood.
But the worst part is how it affected their daily lives. Quote, these forest acts changed the lives of pastoralists. They were now prevented from entering many forests that had earlier provided valuable forage for their cattle. Even in the areas they were allowed entry, their movements were regulated.
Here comes the permit system.
Quote, they needed a permit for entry. The timing of their entry and departure was specified, and the number of days they could spend in the forest was limited.
This is a huge psychological shift.
Quote, Pastoralists could no longer remain in an area even if forage was available. The grass was succulent, and the undergrowth in the forest was ample. They had to move because the Forest Department permits that had been issued to them now ruled their lives.
That sentence is chilling. Permits now ruled their lives.
Nature no longer told them when to move. Legal bureaucracy did.
If your permit expires on Tuesday, you leave on Tuesday, even if the grass is perfect.
Okay, change 3, the Criminal Tribes Act. Quote, third, British officials were suspicious of nomadic people. They just trusted mobile craftsmen and traders who hawked their goods in villages, and pastoralists who changed their places of residence every season, moving in search of good pastures for their herds.
The suspicion is the key here.
Quote, the colonial government wanted to rule over a settled population. They wanted the rural people to live in villages, in fixed places, with fixed rights on particular fields. Such a population was easy to identify and control.
A modern state functions on addresses and boundaries.
Quote, those who were settled were seen as peaceable and law-abiding. Those who were nomadic were considered to be criminal.
Nomads threaten colonial control simply by moving.
So they passed a massive law. Quote, in 1871, the colonial government in India passed the Criminal Tribes Act. By this act, many communities of craftsmen, traders, and pastoralists were classified as criminal tribes.
Let that sink in for a second.
Quote, they were stated to be criminal by nature and birth. Once this act came into force, these communities were expected to live only in notified village settlements. They were not allowed to move out without a permit. The village police kept a continuous watch on them. I have to stop and emphasize how shocking this is to a modern listener. Imagine being legally classified as a criminal from birth just because you travel for work.
It is literal mass house arrest. They corralled human beings just to make them easier to administer.
And once they were trapped, they hit them with change 4,
Right.
taxation. Quote, fourth, to expand its revenue income, the colonial government looked for every possible source of taxation. So tax was imposed on land, on canal water, on salt, on trade goods, and even on animals.
They taxed everything.
Quote, pastoralists had to pay tax on every animal they grazed on the pastures. In most pastoral tracts of India, grazing tax was introduced in the mid-19th century. The tax per head of cattle went up rapidly, and the system of collection was made increasingly efficient.
And how did they collect it?
Greedily. Quote, in the decades between the 1850s and 1880s, the right to collect the tax was auctioned out to contractors. These contractors tried to extract as high a tax as they could to recover the money they had paid to the state and earn as much profit as they could within the year.
Basically using bounty hunters to squeeze the nomads dry.
But then the government took over. Quote, by the 1880s, the government began collecting taxes directly from the pastoralists. Each of them was given a pass. To enter a grazing tract, a cattle herder had to show the pass and pay the tax. The number of cattle heads he had and the amount of tax he paid was entered on the pass.
This connects so well to modern endless fees.
Like being charged per mile you drive on a road you used to drive for free. It drastically cuts into your ability to feed your family.
So what is the actual result of all these restrictions?
That brings us to part 4. How did these changes affect the lives of pastoralists? Let me read the aftermath. Quote, these measures led to a serious shortage of pastures. When grazing lands were taken over and turned into cultivated fields, the available area of pasture land declined.
A simple, tragic math problem.
Quote, similarly, the reservation of forests meant that shepherds and cattle herders could no longer freely pasture their cattle in the forests. As pasture lands disappeared under the plow, the existing animal stock had to feed on whatever grazing land remained.
Remember that organic conservation we talked about in part 1?
Where they let the grass recover?
Yes.
Yeah.
The colonial laws broke that mechanism.
The text explains exactly how. Quote, this led to continuous intensive grazing of these pastures. Usually nomadic pastoralists grazed their animals in one area and moved to another area. These pastoral movements allowed time for the natural restoration of vegetation growth. When restrictions were imposed on pastoral movements, grazing lands came to be continuously used and the quality of pastures declined.
The grass was into the dirt and the roots died.
Quote, this in turn created a further shortage of forage for animals and the deterioration of animal stock. Underfed cattle died in large numbers during scarcities and famines.
It was an engineered ecological cascade. They starved the animals by fencing in the land.
There is also a quote here from the Royal Commission on Agriculture in 1928 confirming this. Quote, the extent of the area available for grazing has gone down tremendously. The breeders find it difficult to raise large herds. Their earnings have gone down. The quality of their livestock has deteriorated.
The government itself admitted it was destroying them.
And the political borders caused chaos, too. Listen to this part about the partition of India. Quote, in 1947, with the partition of India and Pakistan, the camel and sheep herding Raikas, for instance, could no longer move into Sindh and graze their camels on the banks of the Indus, as they had done earlier. The new political boundaries between India and Pakistan stopped their movement.
A new border drawn on a map literally slices through an ancient migration route.
So they had to pivot. Quote, so they had to find new places to go. In recent years, they've been migrating to Haryana, where sheep can graze on agricultural fields after the harvests are cut. This is the time that the fields need manure that the animals provide.
They found a new symbiotic relationship.
So how did they adapt long term? Let me read the final section of the India story. Quote, pastoralists reacted to these changes in a variety of ways. Some reduced the number of cattle in their herds, since there was not enough pasture to feed large numbers. Others discovered new pastures when movement to old grazing grounds became difficult.
So they shrank and rerouted.
Quote, over the years, some richer pastoralists began buying land and settling down, giving up their nomadic life. Some became settled peasants cultivating land, others took to more extensive trading.
The rich survived by changing their entire culture.
But the poor were crushed. Quote, many poor pastoralists, on the other hand, borrowed money from moneylenders to survive. At times, they lost their cattle and sheep and became laborers, working on fields or in small towns.
A stark class divide.
But here is the amazing conclusion. Quote, yet pastoralists not only continue to survive, in many regions their numbers have expanded over recent decades. When pasture lands in one place were closed to them, they changed the direction of their movement, reduced the size of the herd, combined pastoral activity with other forms of income, and adapted to the changes in the modern world.
The resilience is incredible.
And here is the ecologist's verdict. Quote, many ecologists believe that in dry regions and in the mountains, pastoralism is still ecologically the most viable form of life.
I love that sentence. It is the mic drop of the chapter.
The colonial administrators thought stationary farming was the only civilized way to live.
But modern science says the colonial administrators were scientifically wrong. Moving animals cyclically is the correct way to manage those ecosystems.
The nomads had it right all along.
Okay, but this collision between bureaucracy and nomads wasn't just in India?
No, it wasn't. The text takes us to a completely different continent. Part 5. Pastoralism in Africa. Let me read the intro. Quote, let us move to Africa, where over half the world's pastoral population lives. Even today, over 22 million Africans depend on some form of pastoral activity for their livelihood.
That is a massive scale.
Quote, they include communities like Bedouins, Berbers, Maasai, Somali, Boran, and Turkana. Most of them now live in the semi-arid grasslands or arid deserts where rain-fed agriculture is difficult. They raise cattle, camels, goats, sheep, and donkeys, and they sell milk, meat, animal skin, and wool.
Very similar to the Indian groups.
Quote, some also earn through trade and transport, others combine pastoral activity with agriculture. Still others do a variety of odd jobs to supplement their meager and uncertain earnings from pastoralism.
And they faced a terrifyingly similar colonial playbook.
Yeah, Section 3.1 asks, where have the grazing lands gone?
Yep.
Well, one of the problems the Maasai have faced is the continuous loss of their grazing lands. Before colonial times, Maasai land stretched over a vast area from North Kenya to the steppes of northern Tanzania.
So a huge contiguous block of land.
But then Europe stepped in. Quote, in the late 19th century, European imperial powers scrambled for territorial possessions in Africa, slicing up the region into different colonies. In 1885, Maasailand was cut into half with an international boundary between British Kenya and German Tanganyika.
They literally sat in conference rooms in Berlin and drew lines across land they barely understood.
And it was a massive land grab. Quote, subsequently, the best grazing lands were gradually taken over for white settlement, and the Maasai were pushed into a small area in South Kenya and North Tanzania. The Maasai lost about 60% of their pre-colonial lands.
60%.
Quote, they were confined to an arid zone with uncertain rainfall and poor pastures.
It's like someone coming into your house, taking your kitchen and living room for themselves, locking the doors, and telling you to survive entirely in a dry, empty hallway.
That's a perfect analogy. And they encouraged local farming, too. Quote, from the late 19th century, the British colonial government in East Africa also encouraged local peasant communities to expand cultivation. As cultivation expanded, pasture lands were turned into cultivated fields.
Just like the wasteland rules in India.
But this next part is wild. They turned the land into parks. Quote, large areas of grazing land were also turned into game reserves. like the Masai Mara and Samburu National Park in Kenya and Serengeti Park in Tanzania. Pastoralists were not allowed to enter these reserves. They could neither hunt animals nor graze their herds in these
The
areas.
Serengeti. When we think of African conservation, we picture a pristine, untouched wilderness.
Right. You picture safari, lions, elephants.
But the text reveals the dark bureaucratic mechanism behind these parks.
Let me read the stats on that. Quote, very often, these reserves were in areas that had traditionally been regular grazing grounds for Maasai herds. The Serengeti National Park, for instance, was created over 14,760 square kilometers of Maasai grazing land.
The Maasai had coexisted with the wildlife there for centuries.
But the British viewed the indigenous people as a threat to the pure nature they wanted to preserve for tourists.
So they banned the humans who had successfully managed that nature.
Section 3.2 is called The Borders Are Closed. Quote, in the 19th century, African pastoralists could move over vast areas in search of pastures. When the pastures were exhausted in one place, they moved to a different area to graze their cattle. From the late 19th century, the colonial government began imposing various restrictions on their mobility.
Just like the Forest Acts.
Quote, like the Maasai, other pastoral groups were also forced to live within the confines of special reserves. The boundaries of these reserves became the limits within which they could now move. They were not allowed to move out with their stock without special permits.
And getting those permits was nearly impossible.
Yeah, the text says, quote, and it was difficult to get permits without trouble and harassment. Those found guilty of disobeying the rules were severely punished.
There's actually a quote here, source F, from a magistrate in Southwest Africa.
Oh, the Kaukolan police instruction. Let me read it. Quote, passports to leave the reserve should under no circumstances be issued to these natives. The only object of these passports is to keep a check on the natives.
Under no circumstances, they criminalized their traditional survival methods.
The text notes that the Maasai couldn't even trade easily. Quote, pastoralists were also not allowed to enter the market in white areas. In many regions, they were prohibited from participating in any form of trade. White settlers and European colonists saw pastoralists as dangerous and savage.
Though they were perfectly happy to use them for labor when they needed to build roads and towns.
Exactly. But the real horror happens during a drought. Section 3.3 is when pastures dry. Quote, drought affects the life of pastoralists everywhere. When rains fail and pastures are dry, cattle are likely to starve unless they can be moved to areas where forage is available. That is why traditionally, pastoralists are nomadic. They move from place to place. This nomadism allows them to survive bad times and avoid crises.
Nomadism is a crisis avoidance strategy.
But the colonial reserves broke that strategy. Quote, but from the colonial period, the Maasai were bound down to a fixed area, confined within a reserve, and prohibited from moving in search of pastures. They were cut off from the best grazing lands and forced to live within a semi-arid tract prone to frequent droughts.
So when the rains failed, they were trapped.
Quote, since they could not shift their cattle to places where pastures were available, large numbers of Maasai cattle died of starvation and disease in these years of drought. An inquiry in 1930 showed that the Maasai in Kenya possessed 720,000 cattle, 820,000 sheep, and 171,000 donkeys. In just 2 years of severe drought, 1933 and 1934, over half the cattle in the Maasai Reserve died.
Half.
Over 50% of their wealth wiped out.
And not just because of the lack of rain, but because a bureaucrat wouldn't issue a permit allowing them to walk to greener grass.
Engineered devastation. And it fractured their society. Let me read the final section, 3.4. Not all were equally affected.
This shows how the social fabric unraveled.
Quote, in pre-colonial times, Maasai society was divided into two social categories, elders and warriors. The elders formed the ruling group and met in periodic councils to decide on the affairs of the community and settle disputes.
So a self-regulating, age-based system?
Quote, the warriors consisted of younger people, mainly responsible for the protection of the tribe. They defended the community and organized cattle raids.
Raiding was how young men proved their capability under the elders' authority.
But the British didn't like this. Quote, to administer the affairs of the Maasai, the British introduced a series of measures that had important implications. They appointed chiefs of different subgroups of Maasai who were made responsible for the affairs of the tribe.
They bypassed the elders entirely.
Quote, the British imposed various restrictions on raiding and warfare. Consequently, the traditional authority of both elders and warriors was adversely affected.
A single administrative decision rewrote their culture.
And it created a wealth gap. Quote, The chiefs appointed by the colonial government often accumulated wealth over time. They had a regular income with which they could buy animals, goods, and land. They lent money to poor neighbors who needed cash to pay taxes.
So the chiefs got rich.
Quote, many of them began living in towns and became involved in trade. Their wives and children stayed back in the villages to look after the animals. These chiefs managed to survive the devastations of war and drought. They had both pastoral and non-pastoral income and could buy animals when their stock was depleted.
Because they had cash, they survived crises. But the regular nomads.
Quote, but the life history of the poor pastoralists who depended only on their livestock was different. Most often, they did not have the resources to tide over bad times. In times of war and famine, they lost nearly everything. They had to go looking for work in the towns. Some eked out a living as charcoal burners, others did odd jobs. The lucky could get more regular work in road or building construction.
Society split into the rich and the poor.
Yeah. The text gives a final conclusion here. Let me read the last paragraph. Quote, so we see that pastoral communities in different parts of the world are affected in a variety of different ways by changes in the modern world. New laws and new borders affect the patterns of their movement. With increasing restrictions on their mobility, pastoralists find it difficult to move in search of pastures. As pasture lands disappear, grazing becomes a problem, while pastures that remain deteriorate through continuous overgrazing. Times of drought become times of crises when cattle die in large numbers.
A grim summary of the colonial impact.
But it ends on a strong note. Quote, yet pastoralists do adapt to new times. They change the paths of their annual movement, reduce their cattle numbers, press for rights to enter new areas, exert political pressure on the government for relief, subsidy, and other forms of support and demand, a right in the management of forests and water resources. Pastoralists are not relics of the past. They are not people who have no place in the modern world. Environmentalists and economists have increasingly come to recognize that pastoral nomadism is a form of life that is perfectly suited to many hilly and dry regions of the world. End quote.
That is such a powerful takeaway for the listener.
We've taken a massive journey today. From the snowy peaks of Kashmir down to the plateaus of Maharashtra, into the deserts of Rajasthan, and across the ocean to the Serengeti in Africa.
And by strictly following this text, we really saw how these communities actually operated.
Not random wandering, but a highly sophisticated, ecologically balanced system.
Which colonial laws systematically tried to erase.
Through land grabs, borders, and taxes, yeah.
But the aha moment is that this nomadic life wasn't backward. Modern science is only just now validating what they knew for centuries.
Which brings me right back to the thought we started with. Throughout this reading, the colonial mindset viewed standing still and owning fixed property as the ultimate sign of civilization.
The GPS map app mentality.
Exactly. But as climate change makes weather patterns more extreme, causing droughts and floods, what if the ability to pick up, move, and adapt is actually the ultimate survival skill of the future?
That is a really profound point.
What if the nomads had it right all along? Something for you to mull over the next time you drop a pin on a map. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.